I think Elden Ring Night Reign is a story about three interconnected themes: trauma, fate, and mercy, and all three are embodied in the character of Heolstor, the Nightlord. And I think Heolstor is a symbol of retribution. He is a punishment for the countless bloody wars waged throughout the history of the Lands Between. An anonymous warrior slain in battle returned as an unstoppable force of destruction. The Lands Between created him through their violence, and now he will unmake them through his. However, for all of his violence and misery, it is a surprising act of mercy which ultimately defines him. In the end, this is as much a story about empathy as it is about cruelty. Okay, so for most of the game, the Nightlord is described with this really grand and villainous language. Characters refer to him as, quote, an abomination, a true horror, a living cataclysm, the enemy of the world, a devourer of worlds. He ravages the Lands Between beyond recognition. This is one of the greatest threats we have ever encountered in a From Software title. If the Nightlord is not stopped, nothing will be left. Everything will be washed away in its azure downpour. There will only be endless night forever. At the start of the game, the world is already barely hanging on by a thread. All that remains is Limveld, this twisted, broken, shifting land. Over the course of the game, the player will face off against the lesser Nightlords, who are themselves extremely powerful, very difficult boss fights. So while fighting these guys, you might think to yourself, holy crap, these are just the underlings. The guy in charge, the true Nightlord, must be something crazy. And when you reach the final battle, your expectations will be turned on their head. The true Nightlord is not given any grand explosive entrance like the others. Instead, he is presented as a distant, lone figure wandering through an empty desert of ash. I think it is important to note how small he appears at first, how lonely and unimpressive. He is hunched over, moving slowly, as if he is struggling to bear the weight he is carrying. His entire body is wrapped in what appear to be bandages, and you can see a violet light swirling underneath. He may wear a twisted crown on his head, but just look at the state of his kingdom. This is what the world will become if the night is not stopped. The rains will wash away everything, leaving behind nothing but a petrified, lifeless desert. This is a classic From Software twist. They love to pull this kind of reveal. They've done it so many times, it's not even a twist anymore. This is what we should have expected. For example, King Allant back in Demon's Souls turned out to be this pathetic, bloated, and weak creature in the end who can be slain in a single strike. Lord Gwyn in Dark Souls turned out to be just another hollow. His soul burned away in the very fire which gave him his power in the first place. Or Marika from Elden Ring, the true god at the center of the Golden Order, who turned out to be this pitiful, shattered husk. From Software consistently portrays power as something that consumes those who seek it. The powerful are never allowed to simply remain powerful. Something always corrodes, breaks, or devolves. Rather than salvation, it becomes a self-destructive force that ravages not just bodies, but identities as well. Their humanity is stripped away. Okay, so in his first phase, Heolstor is this somewhat ordinary humanoid figure, wielding a weathered greatsword. He is fast and strong, but his moveset is fairly ordinary. You know, a lot of dashes and strikes and slashes. It's kind of a typical sword fight. However, when you reach his second phase, things get a little crazy. The bandages are torn open, black smoke pours out, filling the entire arena, and then his true form is revealed. Heolstor is no longer human at all. His body has almost entirely disintegrated. There is nothing left of him but the shadows of night. His only remaining human body part appears to be this left arm. In this form, he wields the full power of the night, which allows him to slice open reality itself. He also has 3 arms, so what's up with that? Is this important? I don't know, maybe. Leaving that aside, something that definitely is important is that rune glowing inside his chest. This is the Primordial Nightlord's rune, and it has replaced his very soul. Notice in Wilder's ending, after we win this battle and take the rune for ourselves, the Nightlord collapses like a broken puppet. Without the rune, he is just a corpse. Which is exactly the same as Marika and Radagon, who held the Elden Ring inside their shared body. That item description of the Primordial Nightlord's rune even compares it to a Great Rune. But wait, that is important too. Great Runes are very powerful, but also relatively common. Our player character can acquire several throughout the game. A Great Rune on its own probably should not have provided Heolstor with enough strength to destroy the Golden Order, much less the entire world. There is something else going on here, but we will discuss that more at the end of the video. For now, let's talk more about his relationship with that rune. For example, Marika has a very complicated relationship with the Elden Ring. It is the source of her godly power, and yet she also resists its influence, questions its true nature, and even ultimately destroys it in the shattering, destroying herself in the process. Okay, for another example, Villainy holds the scarlet rot inside her body. The rot is a contamination or infection that is slowly destroying her, but it is also transforming her into a god, a power which she embraces to defeat Radon in their famous battle. Or Mithra from the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion, who holds some fragment of the Chaos Flame inside his body. Instead of embracing this power, he endures incredible pain and suffering to keep it sealed away, for the sake of the world, to protect others from its destructive fire. He only unleashes it out of frustration when our player character insists on attacking him. My point with each of these examples is that whenever a character in this setting holds some source of great power within their flesh, it is never portrayed to be a simple or symbiotic relationship. Instead, it is always contentious and destructive. In his first phase, Heolstor does not wield the full power of Night. It remains contained inside. The item description of the Vestige of Night relic mentions that those bandages he wears are marked by the engraving of a sealing stone. Is it possible that, just like Villainy and Mithra, Heolstor is holding the night back on purpose? That he does not wish to unleash its destructive power on the world? That he is not the architect of this calamity but just as much of a slave to it as everyone else? Is he even in control of his body anymore? Or is he being piloted by this twisted black rune? In an interview before the game's release, the director, Junya Ishizaki, stated that the night, much like a real-life calamity, is something that was not done by design or intention. It's just something that has occurred naturally. With this in mind, I think you could describe the night as a sort of hurricane. And maybe Heolstor is just the guy who had the unfortunate luck to get trapped in the eye of the storm. Somewhat frustratingly, there is a lot less information available to the player in Night Rain. We just don't have that vast supply of item descriptions and character dialogue that we had back in Elden Ring, so we have to rely a lot more on speculation this time around. But what we do have is this huge body of work that From Software have spent the last decade and a half building, and their stories do tend to explore the same ideas over and over again, just from a different angle. With so little direct information about this guy Heolstor available in-game, I am instead trying to look at his character through the lens of all those other stories. And so let's make another comparison. Slave Knight Gale from the Dark Souls 3 DLC. In Dark Souls 3, Slave Knights were described as undead warriors used as mere fodder in the bleakest of battles. And even after the undead curse caused their skin to char black and their bones to twist, and even after they lost themselves to madness, their masters refused to release them from service. They were forced to fight for an eternity. Gale was not any stronger or smarter than his fellow Slave Knights. But what he did have was something to fight for. He had a purpose. And for the sake of this video, it does not matter what that purpose was, but just know that it was enough to drive him not only to the ends of the earth, but to the end of time itself. The arena in which the player confronts Gale is very similar to Heolstor and the other Nightlords, a lifeless, monotone desert where the passage of uncountable eons has worn everything down to piles of ash. In order to confront Gale, the player has to be transported through time to the end of the world, which I think is the same thing that is happening in Night Rain when we enter the Spirit Shelter. Anyway, the Dark Souls trilogy told this epic story about gods and kings and dragons, all these beings of immense power. But at the end of everything, all that was left were these two nobodies, a Slave Knight and an Ashen One, battling over the fate of the exhausted remains. I think Heolstor's character is meant to tell a similar tale. Let's take a look at the description of the Knight of the Lord relic. It reads, "The country lay in ruin. The man who once was knight had challenged the hero, but he too was no match. He fell, just another body in a great pile. But eventually he awoke, crawling out from underneath the others. Though he had failed to protect anything or anyone, he yet lived, and so he cursed the world. It was the dead of night, and from the sky poured down a great rain." Just like Gale, Heolstor was not some great champion or famous hero, or even dastardly scheming scoundrel. Nothing about him seems to have been special or unique. He was just a former knight defeated in battle and cast down among a pile of corpses, anonymous and forgotten. He is explicitly described as a failure. He wanted to protect something or someone. The description does not provide specifics, but it does seem to indicate that he was driven by noble intentions. He wanted to help. He was not a villain, at least not back then. He just wasn't strong enough. Heolstor did not die. He survived this defeat, but was overcome by despair. In the throes of anguish, he cursed the world, and in that moment, the night was born. An existential calamity with the power to destroy everything. Born not of gods, but from the very ordinary pain of a very ordinary man. Keep in mind his description at the round table does explicitly describe him as its origin. It says, "Beyond the boundless night there lies the hazy figure of a person. That is the night's origin, and enemy to the world." The night, whatever it is, a natural disaster, an outer god, recluse's shadow hatchling grown out of control, or something else, and we will discuss its true nature in more detail in my next video, but whatever it is, it did not exist before this moment. Now let's talk about the hero who is mentioned in that relic description. The man who once was knight had challenged the hero, but he too was no match. Those are all of the details we are given about this mysterious person. Well, the term hero is a generic description that gets thrown around all over the place in Elden Ring's lore. One of the battle monuments describes a lone hero defending Castle Morn against Marika's armies. Another describes Morgott as stacking high the corpses of heroes during the second defense of Leyndell. The description of the hero's rune consumable reads, "There were once heroes who walked the battlefields, abundantly blessed by the Erd Tree itself, who upon earning their honor simply died." The writers use the word hero to describe any champion who performs great deeds on the battlefield. So I don't think we should get too hung up on trying to figure out the specific identity of this person who slew Heolstor in battle. Because what defines Heolstor's tragedy is not who defeated him, but the contrast between his obscurity and his opponent's greatness. The nameless nobody versus the champion. Now let's talk about Heolstor's name. In the Japanese version, he is called Nameless, which literally translates to nameless. The English version, Heolstor, is an Old English word which roughly translates to darkness. So Heolstor is not a name, it's just what he is. Darkness, shadows. I think this deliberate erasure of his identity by the writers transforms him from a man into a symbol. Stripping away his name and personality and individuality allows him to be a blank narrative vessel to carry the collective anguish of all of the unnamed soldiers whose bodies litter the lands between. His anonymity allows him to be not just one forgotten soldier's tragedy, but every forgotten soldier's tragedy. It is not a clever mystery for lore enthusiasts to solve. It is something more like an allegory. He is a living embodiment of war's tendency to reduce all the complexity and brilliance of human life into nothing more than a nameless casualty. However, as we will discuss later, there is evidence that some tiny shrivel of his humanity does still remain within him. For now, remember back at the beginning of this video when I said that Night Rain is a story about three themes: trauma, fate, and mercy. Well, we have already seen trauma here. Heolstor's knight was born in the aftermath of a violent battle, and he is not the only one. Several of the Nightfarers and even a few of the lesser Nightlords also have traumatic origins. For example, look at Chapter 6 of the Wilder's Journal. It reads, "A long night persists, driving his kinfolk to madness. After a horrific battle, all that remains upon the Windwale Knoll is a sea of gravestones. After the deaths of cousin Farhad, little Shirin, and his own father, the clan's chieftain, the Wilder discovers that only he remains. And now only he can avenge his clan. Only he can bring an end to the night." That image of the Wilder, all alone, surrounded by the gravestones of his clan, is very similar to that image of Heolstor, the lone survivor of a forgotten battle, surrounded by the bodies of the fallen. These two characters, protagonist and antagonist, are practically mirrors to each other. They are both driven by trauma. I bet Heolstor probably wished to avenge his fallen comrades too. Next, let's take a look at the priestess's dialogue in the opening cinematic. As you listen, ask yourself, where can you find the theme of trauma in her exposition? And what is its connection to the night? Okay, here it is.
Long, long ago, the lands between were visited by a great war. The Shattering, as it was known, destroyed order itself. Drawing forth in time an abomination. Thus fell upon us the night. Now heavy rains harry the region, threatening to wash away its very history. The Nightlord does not rest. As it ravages the lands between beyond recognition.
This cinematic makes it clear that the night arose from the Shattering, which just so happens to be the most traumatic event in the history of the lands between, an apocalyptic civil war between demigods, which shattered not just the earth, but the very foundation of order itself. The symbolism here is really heavy-handed. Under the Golden Order, the lands between were a place of shining light. But now, as a result of that terrible civil war, night has very literally fallen. Light has been replaced by shadow. At first, I assumed that Heolstor was killed in one of those battles of the Shattering. However, the cinematic actually says otherwise. The Nightlord seems to have already existed. The violence of the Shattering did not create him, it merely, quote, drew him forth. Moreover, later on, the priestess explicitly describes him as the Primordial Nightlord, and so does his rune, which is named the Primordial Nightlord's rune. The term primordial refers to something that has existed since the beginning of the world, or the beginning of the universe, like primordial gases created in the Big Bang. So to be described as primordial means that Heolstor has been around for a really, really, really long time. Before the Golden Order, or the Erd Tree, or America, and perhaps older than the lands between themselves. He fought and died in a conflict that has been completely lost to history, slain by a hero whose name we will never know, for reasons never recorded, an event so distant in the past that all memory of it has vanished. And just like his identity was erased, he is going to erase the world. There is no actual evidence for this theory, but I like to think that Heolstor was killed in the very first human conflict in this world, like a Cain and Abel situation. He is as old as violence itself. That would fit the description of primordial, right? If you pay close attention to this opening cinematic, you will notice that it shows the earth itself split open by the Shattering, and down in the deepest depths of this new canyon, the azure color of the night rises up towards the surface. And notably, Limveld is split in half by a canyon. It seems as if the armies of the lands between very literally unearthed Heolstor, probably by accident, where he had been buried and sealed away for countless generations, underneath layers upon layers of sediment built up over the long centuries. It reminds me of yet another character from a previous From Software title, Manus, Father of the Abyss from Dark Souls. Manus was described as a primeval man, which is a similar term to primordial, but not quite as old. In that story, the people of a kingdom called Ulasil were tricked into delving deep into the earth and overturning his prehistoric grave, thus accidentally unleashing the Abyss, which is this realm of darkness and shadow threatening to overrun the entire world, consuming everything in its path. Again, very similar to the Night, which is unleashed alongside Heolstor. Both Manus and Heolstor, along with the Abyss and the Night, could be described as the inevitable consequences of the darkness contained within human nature. We were always destined to unleash these calamitous forces upon ourselves. We are just too stupid and selfish and short-sighted and violent. That is where the theme of fate emerges from the story. According to the description of the Primordial Nightlord's rune, all of this was foreseen long ago by something called the Cutting Gifted Tribe. It even mentions a sin, which is another theme From Software loves to return to. The Dark Souls trilogy was all about some vague original sin, which was responsible for all the world's ills. I know there is going to be a lot of lore speculation about the sin mentioned in this description, but I think, just like Heolstor's identity, this is not meant to be some carefully hidden lore riddle for us to unravel. I think it's meant to be thematic and symbolic. It does not matter what the specific sin was or who committed it. What matters is that this sin has condemned the entire world and everyone in it. The Nightlord is our punishment. A dead soldier returned to life to embody the consequences of humanity's endless wars and infinite capacity for cruelty. However, the theme of fate is complicated in Night Rain because it is not unbreakable. For example, fate dictates that the priestess will be destroyed along with the Round Table Hold when the Nightlord is defeated. But the Wilder can release her from this fate by taking on the mantle of the Nightlord himself, forcing the Round Table Hold to be remade with a new priestess. And it seems that Heolstor may be able to break free from his fate too. The description for the Trace of Night key item says, "The qualities of the Nightlord, bearing the manifest potential to alter fate itself." The language is a bit muddled here, but it sounds like Heolstor, as Nightlord, inherently possesses the power to change fate. And maybe he already has. According to Night Rain's director in that same interview I cited earlier, the entire story of Night Rain takes place inside an alternate timeline. Marika had concocted this convoluted scheme where the Age of Shattering was supposed to conclude with the rise of a tarnished Elden Lord who would restore the lands between. But instead, this timeline has been twisted by the arrival of the Nightlord. But if it has been changed once, that means it can be changed again. As bleak and miserable as they are on the surface, From Software's stories always contain this note of hope and optimism. In every single game, no matter how terrible the state of the world has become, we can still fix this. We are not lost yet. In Night Rain, the Nightfarers can succeed here. And as we are going to see in at least one of the endings, Heolstor himself places his hand on the Wheel of Fate to change the world's destiny yet again. But first, let's talk more about this rune, the Primordial Nightlord's rune. Its item description is very frustrating to me because it says absolutely nothing about the Night, or Heolstor, or this rune, or where it came from. Oh well, whatever, since the description is no help whatsoever, let's look at the lore of Elden Ring. What does that tell us about the nature of runes? Well, we know that almost every single rune we encounter in that game, from the great runes wielded by the demigods, all the way down to the smallest broken rune consumable, are all fragments of the Elden Ring, shattered long ago by Queen Marika. Moreover, we know that the Elden Ring itself is actually a living creature, the Elden Beast, a star fallen to earth, which an outer god known as the Greater Will once sent to the lands between, presumably to bestow divine order upon its citizens. These runes have the power to reshape reality. For example, Marika removed the Rune of Destined Death from the Elden Ring, which allowed her and her family to live forever. However, there were also 3 very unique runes, which were not originally connected to the Elden Ring. They had different origins. These are the 3 Mending runes, each of which was birthed not by an outer god, but by relatively ordinary humans. They are the Mending rune of Perfect Order, created by Goldmask, the Mending rune of the Death Prince, created by Fia, and the Mending rune of the Fell Curse, created by the Dung Eater. They all seem to require some form of sacrifice. After all 3 of their creators died during the creation process. They are created by humans who possess both an extraordinary individual will and also a clear-eyed vision of how they believe the world should change. And more than that, the Mending runes actually do have the power to create that change, to transform the world according to its creator's vision. So I suspect that the Primordial Nightlord's rune was born via a similar process. It was not a fragment of the Elden Ring. It may even predate the Elden Ring. Remember, it is described as primordial. But rather than the result of his strength of will, this was the result of the depth of his despair. His hatred and anguish were so terrible that they formed a new great rune, one that possessed terrible destructive power. But wait, what about that 3rd theme I mentioned at the beginning of the video? What about mercy? Where does that fit into this story of sin and cruelty and punishment? Well, let's take a look at the description of the Night of the Beast relic. It reads, "The wolf pup, born with 3 heads, was feared by its peers and driven out of the pack. But its will to live was strong indeed. Upon a rain-swept night, it seized a man's sword with its great jaws. But he showed no fear. He did not seek to harm the wolf, but instead took it into his arms. It has remained at his side ever since, always carrying that very sword." This describes the origins of Gladius, the Beast of Night, one of the lesser Nightlords. Whoever that man was, he showed mercy to that poor, starving, lonely creature. He saved its life, and in that act, they formed an inseparable bond. And it could only have been Heolstor, right? There are no other men connected to the Night besides him. This act of mercy complicates his character. He is not just a punishment for our sins. He is also an example of the human capacity for empathy. That description of the man taking the wolf into his arms reminds me of the conclusion to the Recluse's questline. Okay, so I will discuss this in more detail in my next video, but the Recluse once gave birth to a shadow hatchling, which she lost control of. Chapter 6 of her journal reads, "It was then that it lost itself and bared its fangs at us. With time I have come to understand. It was yet young and afraid, and I did not think to take it in my arms, to offer comfort of any kind." The Recluse abandoned her own child. However, at the end of her questline, she does the opposite. She quells the shadow by embracing it, by showing it love and mercy in the exact same way that Heolstor did to Gladius. But it took the Recluse a long time to reach that point. The shadow hatchling, after being abandoned by its mother, first sought shelter elsewhere, and the 5th chapter of her journal tells exactly where it went. It reads, "I am certain, after mine infant disappeared itself that day, it must have had an audience with the Nightlord. It ravened as if its appetite knew no bound. It would devour shadows of any stripe. The Nightlord's own shade surely seemed irresistible to it. What must have become of my creature after it did feast?" From the example of Gladius, we know that Heolstor, against all expectations, is a merciful character, willing to embrace those wretched creatures who have been cruelly driven away by others. I strongly suspect that, during this audience, Heolstor would have embraced the shadow hatchling too. However, in an ironic twist, I think this kindness may have actually doomed them both. As I mentioned earlier, I do not believe that the Primordial Nightlord's rune, being only the equivalent of a Great Rune, should have been powerful enough on its own to destroy the entire world. And there is a line from the Iron Menial during Recluse's questline, where he is discussing the Shadow Hatchling's transformation into the Nightlord, and he says,
"Now, as you tell it, the Nightlord grew from a shadow hatchling. If that is true, then there may indeed be some degree of culpability. But can we unquestioningly assume that a single enchanted organism could mature so fantastically? I must say, I doubt that it could be so simple.
So, no single enchanted organism could mature into the Nightlord. But what about two enchanted organisms? What if, and this is speculation, just a theory, but what if, when Heolstor embraced the Shadow Hatchling, they formed some kind of toxic symbiotic bond? Two lost and lonely and bitter and angry and frightened and traumatized creatures, merging together, feeding off each other, until their unchecked power grew into something beyond either of their control. A terrible storm which threatened the entire world. Or maybe they did not want to control it. Maybe they were both so angry, so consumed by a desire to get back at those who had hurt them, that they let it grow out of control on purpose. That is something I will discuss in more detail in my next video. But before we end this video, we have to look at one more thing. The bone-like stone whose description reads, a disturbing stone with a distinct lifelessness. The bone of an outer god with the power to expunge divine essence, but that can be destroyed by the same essence. The choice was left to the witch, as per the wishes of the one who bestowed it. Alright, so I suspect that this is Heolstor's bone, one of the final remaining pieces of his human body. It is so old that it has been petrified, transformed into stone, which matches his primordial age. The distinct lifelessness fits him as well, since he is basically dead in every way that matters, a lifeless puppet animated only by his great rune, and it has the power to expunge divine essence. Well, Heolstor does seem to expunge the influence of the other outer gods from the lands between. He destroys the Golden Order, the Erd Tree, the Elden Ring itself. There are only small fragments of the Chaos Flame and Scarlet Rot remaining in Limveld, and those two are under threat of being washed away by the Night's Rain. I do not think it would be an exaggeration to say he has the power equivalent to that of an outer god. I mean, he is currently erasing the entire world, right? The only other being who can do that is the Chaos Flame. Alright, and who gave the witch this bone? Well, of course, it was Heolstor himself. The Iron Menial makes that clear in this dialogue. Here it is.
While unconscious, I had a dream. I was handed this by the Nightlord. Well, I didn't see our foe per se, but I know it to be true. I sense a great power within. Power enough to change a person's fate, I do believe.
The Recluse writes the same thing in Chapter 7 of her journal, which reads, the child with the Nightlord bequeathed me the last thing I needed in my search. Bone-like stone. The infant's voice can be heard when softly touching the stone. Please have patience. I shall come to thee, I swear. So Heolstor gifted the Recluse a piece of his own body, a fragment of his power, which we already know from the Trace of Night description is the power to alter fate itself. With this stone, the Recluse is able to finally fix her mistake and embrace her lost child. In this way, it is Heolstor, his final act of mercy, which allows mother and child to be reunited, and allows the shadows of night, his night, to finally be laid to rest. In the end, it is compassion, not violence or battle prowess, which saves the world. Heolstor's character is filled with contradictions. He is both a man and a natural disaster. He is both an ordinary soldier slain in a forgotten battle and the greatest threat the lands between have ever faced. He is both an arbiter of fate and seemingly trapped by fate. He is both the cause of incredible pain and suffering and loss of life, but also defined by his mercy. In some ways, he does not seem to be a character at all. He is more of a symbol, a nameless representation of all the anonymous warriors cut down during the countless wars that have raged in the lands between over the course of its long and bloody history. He is the curse of human nature made manifest, our deepest flaws given form, but also our greatest strengths, mercy and empathy. And he is only one half of the equation. The knight itself is just as much of a character in this story as he is, and it is an even more obscure and mysterious one than Heolstor himself, something closely connected to him, but also raging outside of his control. So, next time we are going to examine this night and try to understand how it fits into our themes of trauma, fate, and mercy.